Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. Tonight we're going to be talking about when egos collide in rock and roll. You know, it reminds me of that term, the lion's share. Now, the lion's share is a term that usually denotes a small group of people who will receive the lion's share of profits, monies, power, and all of that. Or in the case of a rock band, it can be one individual member who gets the lion's share of the monies that the band makes. Now, that can either be given voluntarily by other members of the band because they know that individual has so much to offer, they have no choice but to go ahead and make sure that individual receives the lion's share of the band's profits. Or it can be one individual in the band who thinks they're so special that they demand the lion's share of what a band makes. Now, this can be the lion's share of what is made off of their albums or the lion's share of what is made off of their tours. Now, a famous example of that that I can remember is when Mark Farner and Grand Funk decided to tour again together, and Mark Farner demanded the lion's share of what the bands made live. Never mind the fact that he already made extra monies by being the band's prominent songwriter. You see, when you write a song in a group, the money or royalties to that song goes to the individual songwriters. I felt Mark already made extra monies from Grand Funk because of his writing capabilities, but when they decided to tour, he decided he should get the lion's share of what that tour would make. Now, just the other night on the Four Horsemen, we were discussing a ton of brand new tours that are coming out in 2026. And a day or two later, I ran into this article regarding the band Poison. It's entitled Poison Nick's Tour After Bret Michaels Demands 600% More Than the Band. Now, the article reads, Poison has dropped plans for a 2026 tour after frontman Bret Michaels allegedly demanded 600% more than his bandmates. Poison has dropped plans for a 2026 tour. Though a tour was never officially announced, the hair metal greats made no secret of their plans to celebrate their 40th anniversary. Michaels was quoted as saying, "It would make perfect sense to have the possibility of a reunion in 2026. But now the tour is off, and the reason seems to be money." Drummer Ricky Rocket said, "We had a great offer, I thought, but we left the table." Really, what it came down to was guitarist CC and the bassist Bobby and I were all in, and I thought Bret was. But he wanted the lion's share of the money, to the point where it makes it not possible to even do it. Now, the drummer goes on to say, "I don't do this just for the money. I do have a lot of love for this, absolutely. But at the same time, you don't want to go out and work really hard just to make somebody else in the band rich." Now, they asked him, could the band possibly tour with another lead singer? He said, "It's not out of the question, but doing that is like surgery. It's a last resort. I don't want to do that. I'm not quarreling with Bret. We just didn't come to an arrangement." Now, when you think about that and the power that Bret Michaels has with Poison, you can even see in this interview that the drummer is very concerned, but he's very careful how he even talks about Bret. That's because Bret Michaels and CC, the guitarist, are responsible for most of the writing in that band. But Bret isn't responsible for all of the writing. He usually comes up with the lyrics and possibly the melody. The rest of the band work everything out, with CC often coming up with chord structures, all stuff that can be part of owning a song. Now, Poison has traditionally credited all the members of the band for writing their material, and to tell you the truth, I think that's the fair way to do this. I've written songs and jammed with a drummer. The drummer changed the complexion of the entire song, and I rewrote the lyrics to that song due to the input of that drummer. A drumming pattern is not copyrightable, but I knew personally as a songwriter that song would have never surfaced without that drummer's input. Which gets us to the theme of the entire video tonight: when egos collide. You know, it reminds me of my favorite band of all time, the Beatles. Now, when the Beatles first got together and Paul and John first met at that fete, you'll notice that Paul was all in to join. Well, he played a little coy, but he was in. After all, a lot of those individuals were even older than him, and it was a chance for him to work with older, more experienced musicians, even if they only had one or two performances under their belt. Notice Paul later asked for George Harrison, who was a bit younger than Paul. This would give Paul more status in the Beatles. As the Beatles became more and more successful, the writing talents of both John Lennon and Paul McCartney drove that band early on. But it wasn't long before George Harrison was writing fabulous material, and even Ringo coming up with a couple of tunes himself. Of course, after the death of Brian Epstein, Paul took a central role. John was tiring of the workload. He wanted time off. He wanted to write when he felt like writing, whereas Paul thought of it more as a job that needed to be done. It wasn't long before John was resenting Paul's new leadership. George never exactly excited by either John or Paul leading the Beatles, and even Ringo at the end was pretty much done with that band. Now, Paul will tell you it was his job to keep that band going. Even Ringo has said in the past that if Paul wasn't constantly calling the Beatles at their home to get them back into the studio, the Beatles' output would have been nowhere near what it turned out to be. Even George Harrison said all four Beatles were guilty of ego trips. He said that the egos in that band were absolutely out of control. Even him and Ringo could be right bastards at times. Which leads me to another favorite band of mine, and of course that's Fleetwood Mac. Of course, I like Fleetwood Mac in its many different variations, but there's no doubt that the most successful incarnation of Fleetwood Mac was with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. At first, the band only wanted Lindsey. It was through Mick Fleetwood meeting Lindsey Buckingham and knowing he needed to have that guitarist in. Now, Lindsey was shacking up with Stevie Nicks at the time. They were an item. He was loyal to that relationship and that professional relationship they had as well. He demanded that if they wanted him, they'd have to take Stevie. So off to a good start, right? Well, it wasn't long before the band was sleeping with each other, sleeping out on each other. The egos that culminated out of that initial success was there pretty much right from the next album on. There's no doubt that at first it was primarily Lindsey Buckingham who didn't take the news of him and Stevie not being an item anymore, and he could be an outright asshole. But he learned his lessons over the years, and of course, Stevie had a very successful solo career besides that of Fleetwood Mac. And so her ego grew, and it wasn't long before she was demanding that Lindsey Buckingham, 1/3 of their writing partnership, their producer. Their genius guitar player was out of the band because of her own egotistical demands. Well, her career isn't what it once was, but demands for a Fleetwood Mac tour is still red hot. And if you notice last year, Nick's and Buckingham's album that they put out before ever joining Fleetwood Mac has resurfaced, even having reissues, and it's quite popular. All of a sudden, Stevie Nicks, without the assurity of a hyper-successful solo career, is making little love notes to Lindsey Buckingham when that album was reissued. There have been hints of that band reforming without Christine McVie for one more tour. But you know, it doesn't stop with just the Beatles or Fleetwood Mac or Poison for that matter. It continues with bands like the the Eagles. Early on, the Eagles brought on Don Felder as their full-time, permanent, full-membered lead guitarist. But over the years, as the egos of Don Henley and Glenn Frey increased, even encroaching onto their manager, the manager decided to take sides, and it wasn't very long before Don Felder was voted off the island. Now, in the case of all these bands, a lot of money went to these key members, either through what they wrote, songwriting royalties, or the power they held in the band. Lindsey Buckingham was their producer. They couldn't go anywhere without him, and Christine McVie and Stevie Nicks wrote the bulk of their biggest hits, probably, and so they had a say in the band. With the Beatles, obviously, John and Paul had the most power. They wrote the most songs. They wrote the most hits. And with almost as many hits as the Beatles, the Eagles also had a pair of songwriters that dominated in that way. But was that true because they wrote the best songs, or that their material, although great, by the way, was pushed to the fore over Joe Walsh and even Don Felder? Hell, you can even say that Timothy B. Schmidt suffered under those circumstances. And now we have Bret Michaels, who at the very most writes the lyrics, some of the melodies to a band that all co-wrote together, is demanding a 600% increase in what he gets paid over the rest of the band. What do you guys think of that? You know, over the years, I've seen egos destroy more bands than bands who have stayed together. And when you think about what a band is, it's a group. We call them rock bands, we call them rock groups, but essentially it's a group of people who love the hell out of each other at the first, but when they get into the business and they see the money and the power that can be obtained in that business, they start watching out for number one. And that leads me to the question for the tribe tonight. I want you to give me examples of bands who have managed to sidestep these kinds of issues. It can be bands where one or two individuals write most of the hits, but somehow they've managed to make everybody in the band happy, and because of that, they've had long, sterling rock and roll careers. All right, folks, that does it for the video tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up. That helps with views. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to this thing we call the tribe, that's easy to do. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, tap that top bell icon, and you'll be notified of every single one of my videos and my streams. And by the way, join me tomorrow night on my stream. We're going to continue with the Mount Rock Olympus Hall of Fame. Parts 1 through 5 are already out. You guys can go over there. Go to my post page and vote on every single one of those parts because for the first time, as far as a Rock Hall of Fame, this time, this Hall of Fame is going to be empowered by the fans. Who are the fans? That's you folks, because it's always wise to remember, we are the tribe.